November 1887, Montana Territory. A sky the color of a bruised deep blue, hard and merciless, stretched from one end of the Bitterroot Valley to the other. No clouds, no mercy, just cold pressing down on everything beneath it like a hand on a throat. 31 degrees below zero. The valley floor lay silent, frozen, every cabin shuttered, every chimney bleeding smoke into air too cold to carry it far. Wood stacked outside front doors disappearing faster than anyone had planned. Children tucked against mothers. Fires fed through the night, fed again before dawn. 32 days of this, and then a thin thread of smoke, not from the valley, from the hillside, from a door-shaped shadow cut into the slope above something between a house and the earth itself, something no one in this valley had believed would stand. Inside that shadow, a woman sat with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The fire had been out for 6 hours. She was not cold. November 1887, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. The fire had been out for 6 hours. Mabry Vick stood in the doorway of the dugout with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. 34 years old, hands rough enough to strike a match on. The temperature outside was 22 degrees below zero, and the wind was doing something that didn't have a polite name. She wasn't cold. That was the problem. Or rather, that was the answer. The answer that every family in this valley was going to spend the rest of the winter being too proud to ask for. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 5 months earlier, Mabry Vick had been standing in her cabin at 3 in the morning watching her daughter struggle to breathe. Let's go back to that night first, because that's where this story really begins. Not in the dugout, not in the victory, in the dark, in the cold, in a woman standing barefoot on a wooden floor, listening to a sound no mother should ever have to get used to, the wet, rattling cough of a child who'd been sick since December and hadn't stopped. Cass was 5 years old, and she coughed like something twice her size was living in her chest. Every night, the same sound. Every morning, Mabry would check, still breathing, still pink, still here. And every morning she would exhale, add wood to the fire, and tell herself this winter would be different. It wasn't different. It was exactly the same. The cabin was 16 feet by 20, log walls chinked with moss and clay, stone fireplace on the north wall, raised plank floor, shake roof. Edgar had built it the spring they arrived, 1885, and he'd built it properly, the way a man who knew carpentry was supposed to build. Every joint tight, every beam true, and it was still cold. Not uncomfortable cold, not drafty cold, the other kind. The kind where you wake at 3 in the morning and the water bucket near the wall has a skin of ice on it. The kind where the fire demands feeding every 2 hours, or the room temperature falls 30 degrees in the time it takes to fall asleep and wake again. The kind where a 5-year-old girl develops a cough in December that doesn't quit until April. And even in April, when it finally stops, you're not sure if it stopped because she got better or because the cold finally let go of her. Mabry knew the difference. Edgar didn't. That wasn't a criticism. It was just true. Edgar Vick was a good man, a careful man, a man who could read the grain of a piece of timber better than most men could read a sentence, and who had come to Montana Territory in the spring of 1885 with $200, a young wife, and the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been tested by a Montana winter. He built what he knew. He built what worked back east. What worked back east was not what worked here. The summer of 1887 was the summer Mabry stopped waiting for things to change on their own. It started with a rock. July. Edgar was repairing the cabin's north foundation. A frost heave had pushed one of the cornerstones out of alignment, as frost heaves do, as they always do, as they would keep doing until someone addressed the actual problem instead of the symptom. Edgar was wedging the stone back into place with a crowbar, and when he broke it loose from the frozen earth beneath, the inside of it was warm, not warm like a living thing, warm like a held breath, like something that had been pressed against the earth all winter and absorbed slowly, patiently, without drama, every degree of heat the ground had to give. Edgar noticed it, the way a man notices a stone. He set it aside, went back to work. Mabry picked it up. She stood there holding it in both hands, turning it over, and she heard her father's voice. Her father's name was Declan Moore. He had worked the coal mines of western Pennsylvania for 31 years, and he knew more about the inside of the earth than most men knew about their own living rooms. He was not a sentimental man. He was not the type to say things that could be printed on a wall. But when Mabry was 7 years old and followed him down into a mine shaft for the first time against her mother's explicit wishes, clutching the back of his coat, he had crouched down, placed her small hand flat against the tunnel wall, and said, "Stone doesn't argue with cold Rowena. It just outlasts it." Rowena, that was what he'd called her, a private name between them. She hadn't thought about it in years. She thought about it now. She looked at the warm rock in her hands. She looked at the hillside behind the cabin, south-facing, good drainage, rocky soil, sun on it most of the afternoon. She looked at Lorne, her 8-year-old son, who was helping Edgar, hand tools and pretending he understood what they were for. She thought about Cass, still inside sleeping through the morning, with the faint whistle in her breathing that never entirely disappeared, even in summer. She set the rock down. She walked to the hillside. She started counting. Edgar didn't know what she was doing until she told him at dinner, which in retrospect was the wrong order of events. She should have led with the conclusion, not the plan. She should have said, "Our daughter is sick every winter, and I've found a way to fix it." Instead, she said, "I'm going to dig into the hill." Edgar put his fork down. "I'm going to build a room inside the hillside," she continued, south-facing, 12 feet deep into the slope, 16 by 20 interior, stone floor, sod roof, central hearth. He looked at her for a long time. "We have a cabin," he said. "The cabin doesn't work. The cabin is fine. Cass coughs from December to April. Children cough." She picked her fork back up. "I'm going to start digging next week." Edgar was quiet for a moment. The way he got quiet, not angry, not dismissive, just very still, the way timber is still before you cut it and find out what's inside. "You're a carpenter's wife," he said finally. "Not a carpenter." She looked at him. "Our daughter is sick, Edgar. I'm going to fix it." He didn't say anything else that night. She didn't need him to. She chose a spot 300 yards upslope from the cabin, south-facing exactly. The hill rose at a gentle angle there, enough to dig into, but not so steep that drainage would be a problem. Rocky soil good, that meant stable walls, a clear view to the valley below. She walked the slope in the early morning, before Edgar was up, before Lorne was up, before Cass stirred from sleep. She paced off the dimensions with her boots. She pressed her palm flat against the earth in 6 different spots and felt in each one a temperature that the surface of the ground in winter would not reach for another 4 months. 52 degrees. The earth 6 inches down was 52 degrees. She started digging on a Tuesday in July. No announcement, no ceremony. She borrowed the heaviest pick from the tool shed, walked uphill before sunrise, and started taking the mountain apart one swing at a time. The first person to notice was Lorne. He was 8. He noticed everything. He appeared at the edge of the excavation on the third morning, still holding his breakfast biscuit, watching his mother work with the focused attention of a child who has decided that whatever this is, he wants to be part of it. "What are you building?" "A room. Inside the hill, inside the hill." He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then, "Can I carry rocks?" "Yes." He put the biscuit in his shirt pocket and slid down into the hole. He was not strong enough to be useful. He was exactly useful enough to matter. Every stone he picked up and carried to the pile at the base of the hill was one she didn't have to carry. Every afternoon he spent hauling rocks in a flour sack was an afternoon she didn't spend doing it alone. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask if it would work. He just showed up every morning with his small, serious face and his shirt pocket full of biscuit crumbs, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The second person to notice was Pernell Hacht. This was not good news. Pernell Hacht was 52 years old and owned the only sawmill in the valley, which meant he sold lumber to everyone who built anything within 15 miles, which meant he had a very specific and financial interest in the materials other people chose to construct their buildings with. He was not a cruel man. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had built something, who feared losing it, and who had learned to dress that fear in the language of expertise. He rode past the excavation on a Tuesday morning in August, reined his horse, looked down at Mabry in the hole. She looked up. "Morning, Mrs. Vick." He tilted his head toward the excavation. "How much timber are you needing for this project?" "Door frame," she said. "Roof beam, that's all." He went very still. She watched him do the arithmetic. A house that didn't need timber walls, a family that would spend this winter and every winter after it buying a fraction of what they'd bought before. Multiply that by the families he could already see watching from their fields, watching the Vic woman dig her hole in the hillside, watching with the particular attention of people who hadn't made up their minds yet. Pernell Hacht looked at the excavation, looked at Mabry, looked at the excavation again. He said, rode on. That evening, Mabry learned later, he paid a visit to Odell Quarm. Odell Quarm was 58 years old and had been a carpenter in this valley since 1871. He had built more structures in the Bitterroot than any man alive. He had seen buildings fail and buildings last, and he had the particular authority of a man who has been proven right enough times that people forgot to notice when he was wrong. He came to the excavation on a Thursday in late August, stood at the edge with his arms crossed looking down. Mabry kept working. "You're wasting good timber on that roof, Mrs. Vick," he said. She didn't look up. "How so?" "Because you'll tear it down in a year when you realize you can't live in a dirt hole. No light, no air, damp as a spring cellar. Your children will get sick." She stopped working. She looked up at him. "My daughter has been sick every winter for 2 years in the house I already have," she said. "This is an attempt to fix that." Odell was quiet for a moment. "A timber cabin loses 30 degrees in 2 hours when the fire dies. I know. I've been measuring it." He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. "I'll invite you to come see it in January, Mr. Quarm," she said. "The door will be open." He left. He did not say "you're welcome" or "good day" or anything else. He just turned and walked back down the hill, and she watched him go, and then she picked up her shovel and went back to work. The parade came in steady waves after that. This is what a community looks like when it's trying to be kind and managing to be condescending, not cruel, not angry, just concerned, a succession of well-meaning people who had decided that Mabry Vick was making a mistake and that it was their neighborly duty to inform her. Old Whitmore, who had farmed the valley since 1873, leaned on his fence post as she drove her wagon past. "Here you're moving into a cave, Mrs. Vick." "Not a cave," she said. "What's the difference?" "A cave is natural. Mine has a chimney." He chuckled. She drove on. Abel Price, who ran the trading post, said it with a kind of sad certainty. "Earth walls will weep moisture all winter. You'll be sleeping in mud by February." She said, "I've angled the floor for drainage." He said, "That's not how moisture works." She said, "How does moisture work, Mr. Price?" He changed the subject. The women were different. The women didn't usually stop her directly. They talked to Tessali Harwick instead, who was Mabry's closest neighbor, and the person in the valley most likely to convey a message without making it sound like an attack. Tessali delivered these messages with the practiced neutrality of someone who disagreed with them. "Geraldine Price says you've lost your mind," Tessali reported one morning. "What does Geraldine Price know about thermal mass?" "Nothing. What do you know about it?" "Enough." Tessali was quiet for a moment. "Do you actually know what you're doing?" Mabry looked at her, looked back at the excavation. "My father worked underground for 30 years, she said. "I know what the earth holds and what it gives back. I know that 6 feet down, the temperature doesn't change from July to January. I know that stone absorbs heat for hours and radiates it back slowly. I know that the biggest problem with a timber cabin is not the fire going out. It's that when the fire goes out, there's nothing left to hold the heat." Tessali was quiet. "And I know," Mabry continued, "that Cass cannot spend another winter coughing." A long pause. Tessali said, "What do you need me to carry?" 2 women in a field, no audience, no dramatics, just one woman recognizing in another something that didn't need explaining, the particular stubbornness of a mother who has run out of acceptable options and is now operating on the fuel of something older and quieter than hope. From that day forward, Tessali Harwick showed up twice a week with her own tools. She never complained. She never doubted out loud. She showed up, she worked, she left. And when people in the valley asked her what she thought of the Vic woman's hole in the hill, she said, "I think it'll work." They asked why. She said, "Because she built it." It is important to explain at this point what Mabry was actually building, because the community saw a hole in a hillside and understood it as an act of desperation. What she was building was an act of engineering, and the difference between those two things is everything. The excavation went 12 feet into the south-facing slope. The interior was 16 feet wide, 20 feet deep. The back wall and both side walls were raw earth cut clean and vertical, then shaped and tamped until they stopped crumbling. Earth doesn't give you a smooth surface for free. You earn it foot by foot, and Mabry earned it. The front wall was the only wall exposed to weather. Timber frame, stone chinked into the gaps, single door solid oak, one small window positioned south to catch the winter sun at its lowest angle. The floor she dug down 18 additional inches, then lined with flat river stones packed in sand, level and tight-fitted without mortar, the way her father had described the floors of mine shafts. The earth tells you where the level is if you listen to it. She listened. The floor was level. The roof was the structure she spent the most time on. Timber frame, split shakes, canvas soaked in pine tar for waterproofing. She rendered the pine tar herself over 3 days, stirring it in a cast iron pot until the smell was in her hair and clothes and probably her dreams. Over the canvas 12 inches of live sod roots intact, grass still green on top. The weight was extreme. The insulation value was higher than anything a timber roof could provide. The roots would knit into each other over the first winter and create something that was by spring essentially a living mat, self-repairing, self-sealing, older than any building technique the valley had seen. The fireplace sat in the center of the front wall, smaller firebox than standard, taller chimney than standard. Every stone chosen by Mabry herself from the creek bed, selected for density and the ability to hold heat, rejected if they showed any inclination to flake. Ventilation channels ran near the ceiling, angled up and out through the side of the sod roof, to prevent moisture, to allow the smoke to exit cleanly, to give the air somewhere to go. The logic was simple. Earth holds temperature, stone holds heat, fire heats the stone holds the heat, the earth holds the temperature. You are not fighting the cold. You are borrowing the warmth that the earth has already saved. That's it. That's the whole principle. September brought rain. 3 days of it. Continuous. The kind of Montana autumn rain that comes sideways and doesn't apologize. On the second day, Mabry climbed the hill in the middle of it and found a crack in the western wall of the excavation, horizontal, about 8 feet long. Water was running in along the fault line, pooling on the partly laid stone floor. She stood there in the rain looking at it. Odell Quam was standing at the base of the hill, not close. He'd happened to be checking something on his property and happened to look up. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't come up. She could see on his face that he was already composing the sentence. Told her so. Mabry turned back to the crack. And she thought the water's going somewhere. It's not appearing from nothing. It has a path. It came in along this fault line because this is where the slope directs it. I don't need to stop the water. I need to redirect it. She dug a channel along the base of the western wall, angling downward toward the front entrance, 18 inches deep, a bed of river gravel inside it, a small stone lip at the threshold to direct the water out through a gap in the doorframe. She worked for 6 hours in the rain. She packed her tools at dusk and looked back at the wall. The crack was still there. It would probably always be there, but the water was moving down the channel across the threshold out. She went home. When she reached the cabin door, she looked back up at the hill. The excavation was dark, rain-soaked, half-finished. It looked from the outside like exactly what everyone said it looked like, a hole. She went inside and fed the fire and listened to Cass breathe. It was in early October that Edgar finally came uphill, not to help, not yet. He came one evening when the light was going flat and the temperature was dropping, and she was still working, fitting the last section of the stone floor by lantern light. He stood at the entrance for a long time without speaking. She let him look. The space was different now than it had been in August. The walls had dried and settled. The floor was finished flat stones fitted tight, pale gray against the dark earth. The ventilation channels were cut. The fireplace stood in the front wall, half assembled, the stones stacked and waiting for the final courses of mortar. The timber roof frame was in place. The shakes laid the canvas, tacked down, and tarred the sod, waiting in blocks to be lifted into position. You could see now what it was going to be. Edgar stepped inside. He walked to the back wall and placed his palm flat against the earth. Cool, not cold, not pulling warmth from the room the way a timber wall would, radiating it back out into the night. Just cool, steady, a surface that had made its peace with a stable temperature and was keeping it. He walked to the stone floor and crouched, pressing his knuckles against it. She watched him. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he stood up and he said, "What do you need me to carry?" She recognized the words, the same ones Tessali had said, the same ones Lorne had said in his 8-year-old way, with his biscuit in his pocket. She picked up the hod full of mortar and handed it to him. He took it. They worked in silence until the fire in the lantern went low. By mid-October, the sod roof was on. 12 inches deep roots, knitting grass, already re-greening after the initial shock of transplanting. From a distance, from the valley road below, you could barely see the structure, a small timber facade emerging from the hillside, a door, a window, a thin chimney pipe. Behind it, the hill, unbroken, which was the point. Purnell Hocht rode past on a Thursday and looked up at the hillside for a long time. She watched him from the excavation entrance, though he didn't know she was watching. He was calculating. She could tell. The Vic dugout was starting to look less like a hole in the ground and more like a structure, a real structure, with a door and a window and a chimney and a sod roof that from a distance looked almost tidy. He rode on without stopping. That evening, Mabry learned he gathered men at the trading post and said, "The Vic woman's building something that'll fall in on itself before Christmas." And the men nodded because Purnell Hocht had been right about enough things that they'd stopped making the distinction between the times he was right and the times he needed to be right. But that's not what kept Mabry awake that night. What kept her awake was Cass. The middle of October, 2 weeks before the family would move into the dugout, the cabin still being used, while the finishing work uphill was completed. Cass woke at midnight with a fever of 103. Mabry was at her side before the child had finished her first cough, felt the forehead, felt it again, not the dry, sharp fever of a child fighting off something ordinary, the wet kind, the kind that had settled in and was prepared to stay. Edgar was up. He fed the fire until it was blazing, which is the wrong instinct in a crisis, but it is the instinct of a good man who wants to do something, and fire is what he knows. The fire blazed. The room warmed for about 2 hours. At 3 in the morning, Mabry reached for the wood box and found it empty. She pulled on her coat and her boots and went outside into the dark. 10 below. She walked to the woodpile 40 yards from the cabin door, which felt at 10 below in the dark like 40 miles, and she loaded as much as she could carry, and she walked back. She stepped back inside. She looked at Cass flushed and restless in her blankets, and she placed her palm flat against the nearest wall. Timber, dried pine. She could feel the cold pressing through it from the outside, aggressive and patient, working through every joint, every chink. She thought, this is the thing I'm trying to stop, not the cold outside, the cold inside the walls, the cold that lives in the material of the house itself, that requires constant fire to push back, that the moment the fire goes down, even slightly, begins reasserting itself. She thought about the dugout uphill, earth walls that didn't conduct cold, stone floor that held heat for hours, a mass of sod overhead that didn't transfer temperature either direction, a fireplace that would charge the stones slowly over 2 burns a day, and those stones would discharge slowly over 8 to 12 hours after the fire went out. The cabin had a roaring fire. Cass was still burning. Mabry added wood to the stove, checked Cass again, and spent the rest of the night in the chair between the bed and the fire thinking about physics. Not in that word exactly. She didn't use that word, but she understood the concept. On the 18th of October, 1887, the Vic family moved into the dugout. Mabry carried the last load of kitchen supplies up the hill herself. A crate of preserving jars, a cast iron skillet, a small canvas bag of salt and dried herbs. She stepped through the door and stood for a moment with the crate in her arms, looking at the interior. Finished, it looked different than it had in the months of construction. The walls had settled and darkened. The stone floor was pale in the lamplight, cool underfoot, but not cold. The sod roof overhead muffled the wind completely. Outside it was gusting, and inside there was no sound of it, just the quiet. The particular quiet of being inside, something that was also inside something else. Cass walked in behind her. She looked at the walls, reached out and pressed her small palm flat against the earth, looked up at her mother. "It smells like outside," she said. "Because it is outside," Mabry said. "We're inside the hill." Cass considered this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old being told something that doesn't quite fit the category she has. Then she sat down on the stone floor. Lauren came in, after dropped his bag of marbles, looked around with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old evaluating real estate. Satisfactory, somewhat unusual but satisfactory. Edgar came in last. He stood at the threshold and looked at what his wife had built. All of it. The tight walls, the fitted floor, the small precise fireplace, the ventilation channels angled perfectly to carry smoke without creating draft. The window positioned to catch the last of the afternoon sun, which was even at this hour laying a thin, warm stripe across the stone floor. He looked at it for a long time. Mabry lit the first fire, not a big fire, a small, careful fire, the kind the firebox was designed for. She loaded it with dry split pine, one piece at a time, and let it catch properly before she added the second. The stones of the firebox began to warm, slowly, the way stones do, not dramatic, not instant, just a slow absorption of something that holds and holds and holds. The room began to warm, not from the air, from the surfaces, the floor already 52 degrees contributing its stored temperature, the fireplace stones charging, the walls not pulling heat from the room because they were at equilibrium. Cass looked up from the floor where she was sitting. "It's warm," she said. It was 60 degrees in the room. Nobody said anything else. What nobody said in that moment was, "You were right." Not Edgar, not Lorne, not Tessely, who would come by the next morning and run her fingers along the warm earth walls with an expression Mabry would never entirely forget. Nobody said it. But Cass sat on the stone floor of the dugout her mother had dug with her own hands on a cold October night in a Montana valley that had already seen 2 murderous winters, and she breathed quietly, evenly, without the whistle. Mabry sat in the chair by the cold fireplace. Cold because the fire was banked, because the stones were holding, because the earth was holding, because her father had been right about what stone does with cold, and she listened to her daughter breathe. She didn't think about Pernell Hucht. She didn't think about Odell Quarm. She didn't think about the cabins down in the valley, where families were right now stacking wood they couldn't afford against a winter they hadn't prepared for. She thought about her father, his hands, the mine shaft, the wall under her small palm. Stone doesn't argue with cold Rowena. It just outlasts it. She put her hand against the earth wall. The earth held her hand back, and somewhere outside in the valley below, the temperature was already dropping. 14 degrees, 12, 9, not stopping, not pausing, not bothering with any of them. The winter that would rewrite what the Bitterroot Valley thought it knew about cold was 3 weeks away, and Mabry Vick was ready. November 14th, 1887. That was the date the cold arrived. Not gradually, not politely, Not the way cold usually comes to Montana, a degree here, a degree there, the temperature easing downward like a man settling into a chair. This cold came the way a door slams, all at once, with finality. Dawn temperature 18 below zero. By noon, it was 22 below. The sky was the particular blue of extreme cold, not the soft blue of winter mornings, but something harder, crystalline, the kind of blue that has no warmth left in it anywhere. By sunset, the thermometer outside the trading post read 29 below, and the wind had picked up from the northwest, and Purnell Hocht's sawmill was making a sound it had never made before, a low groaning in the timber frame, the wood contracting in ways wood was not meant to contract. He added more fuel to the fire. It helped for about an hour. Up on the hillside, 300 yards above the valley floor, the dugout was warm, 61 degrees to be exact. Mabry knew because she had hung a small glass thermometer from the roof beam, not for vanity, not to prove a point, but because she was the kind of woman who measured things, who had always measured things, who had kept a notebook of temperature readings since the first winter in this valley, filling pages with numbers that nobody else thought mattered. The numbers mattered. The fire had been out since early morning, 6 hours without fire, and the room was 61 degrees. Cass was sitting on the stone floor, not wearing her coat. This is worth saying again slowly. 5 years old, the child who had coughed through 2 consecutive winters, who had kept her parents awake from December to April with the sound of something wet and rattling in her chest, who had on 3 separate occasions developed fevers that climbed high enough that Mabry had sat through the night counting breaths, sitting on the stone floor, no coat, playing with a set of wooden blocks that Lauren had outgrown 2 years ago and that she had claimed as her own, stacking them into towers with the complete seriousness of someone engaged in important architectural work. Her cheeks were pink, the good kind of pink, the playing kind. Down in the valley, the first casualties were practical. Purnell Hocht's family went through 2 cords of wood in the first week. He'd stacked 8 cords before the cold came, which had seemed like an extravagance in October, a surplus, the lumber merchant's equivalent of eating a large lunch. By November 25th, he was doing arithmetic that didn't come out right no matter how many times he ran it. Abel Price at the trading post ran out of split pine on the 19th and started selling greenwood at a premium. Greenwood that hissed and spat and produced more smoke than heat. Greenwood that clogged chimneys with creosote and burned in long, inefficient gas that consumed twice the volume for half the warmth. Odell Quarm's chimney field stone, mortared in 1879, the work of a careful man who knew his craft, cracked on the 21st. A single sharp crack that Odell heard from inside the cabin, sitting at his table, and that he spent the next 20 minutes convincing himself he hadn't heard. He had heard it. Thermal shock. The temperature differential between the fire inside and the air outside had stressed the mortar beyond what it could hold, and the crack spread from the firebox up through the second course of stones. He sealed it with mud and canvas. It held, barely, but it was cold now in the northeast corner of his cabin, the kind of cold that comes through a wall that has been compromised. He moved his bed away from that wall. He put on an extra pair of socks. He sat at his table and stared at the fire and tried not to think about the woman uphill and the things she had built and the fact that she had invited him in January and it was now November and he had not accepted yet. He was not ready to accept. Not yet. Edgar brought in the news from the valley most days. He had work carpentry doesn't stop in winter it accelerates. There are always things to repair, things that contract and split in the cold, things that need a man who knows wood. He came home most evenings stamping snow from his boots, sitting by the fireplace stones for a few minutes before he spoke. November 18th, the Prescott family's water line froze. 3 feet underground, and it froze. November 21st, Odell's chimney cracked. November 25th, Purnell's burning through his wood like he's trying to heat the whole valley. He said these things without satisfaction, without the particular pleasure of someone watching a prediction come true. That wasn't Edgar's way. He said them like a man reading a ledger, factual, careful, a little heavy. On the 25th, Mabry was fitting a new stone into the hearth. She didn't look up when Edgar spoke. "How much are we burning?" he asked. "I loaded it this morning," she said. "Before that 3 days ago." He was quiet. 3 days, he said. "The stones hold it. I told you they would." "I know." Another silence. Longer. "Purnell's burning a cord every 4 days," he said. She set the stone into place, tested it, solid. Then he should have built something that didn't need a cord every 4 days. Edgar looked at her. She looked at him. And then unexpectedly, surprisingly, in the way that the best moments between long married people tend to be, they both started to laugh, quietly, not triumphant, just the laugh of two people who have been cold for a very long time and are for the first time not cold. There is a moment here worth pausing for, because this is the part of the story where I need you to hear something. Have you ever made a decision that everyone around you called crazy? Not once, not just at the beginning, but every step of the way, the planning, the building, the first cold night, the second cold night. Someone was there to tell you that you were wrong. Mabry wasn't exceptional. She wasn't a genius. She wasn't blessed with some supernatural ability to see what other people couldn't. She was a woman with a sick child and a notebook full of temperature readings and a memory of her father's hands pressed against a mine wall. And she had just survived the first 11 days of the worst winter in recorded Montana history with a fire she'd loaded once in 3 days, while everyone who told her she was crazy burned through their winter reserves in the first week. The difference between her and them wasn't intelligence. It wasn't even stubbornness. It was this: she had decided that her daughter was not going to cough through another winter, and she had asked herself not what everyone else was doing, not what the accepted method was, not what looked right from the road, but what would actually work. That question, that one question, it changed everything. Day 14 of the freeze. The temperature had not risen above -18, not once, not for a morning, not for an hour. The cold had settled over the valley like something that had decided to stay, something that had unpacked its things and was not consulting the calendar about when it planned to leave. Families had stopped visiting each other. This is what extreme cold does to a community. Not the first week. The first week people check on each other. They bring firewood. They share news. By the second week, the cost of moving becomes prohibitive. The cost in body heat. The cost in exposure. Every trip outside is a calculation. Is this worth it? The valley contracted. Smoke from chimneys. Those that still had good chimneys rose thin in the still air. At night, Mabry could count them from the dugout entrance, fewer each day. Some families had started banking their fires at night and relying on blankets on each other's body heat on the hope that the cabin walls were insulating better than they actually were. They weren't. Timber walls in Montana, winter, are not insulation. They are a boundary. There is a difference. A boundary says the cold stops here. Insulation says the cold doesn't even get to try. It was on December 3rd that Purnell Hocht came up the hill. Not in the morning, not in the afternoon. At dusk, when the light was going copper and the temperature was already dropping toward the night's low, which would be as it had been for 19 consecutive nights, somewhere around 30 below. Mabry saw him from the window. He was alone. No horse he'd walked from his property, which meant he'd been thinking about this long enough that he hadn't wanted to commit to the visible act of saddling up and riding over. Walking could always be explained as something else. I was just passing. I was checking the fence line. Walking is not a visit. Walking is just walking. He came up the slope slowly. He was wearing his heaviest coat, his buffalo hide gloves, his hat pulled low. Even so, she could tell by the way he moved that he was cold in a way that had become something more than cold, the way your whole body starts to make decisions differently when it's been cold too long. He stood at the dugout entrance. She opened the door before he could knock. They looked at each other. She stepped aside. He came in. He didn't say anything, not a word. Not a greeting, not an explanation, not the beginning of any sentence that might have to be finished. He walked past her into the room, and he stopped. He stood still, and she watched him feel it. The warmth hit him, the way warmth hits a person who has been very cold for a very long time, not as a sensation of pleasure, but as a sensation of relief, so acute it was almost physical. His shoulders dropped, his hands still inside the gloves uncurled slightly. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and looked around the room. Cass was asleep on her pallid cheeks, pink no coat, one arm flung over the side in the careless way of a child who has never in her sleep worried about being warm enough. Lorne was at the table, working through his arithmetic by lamplight. Edgar was in the corner chair reading. A family, in their home, on a night when the valley outside was 30 below zero and the fire in the dugout had been out since mid-morning. 62 degrees, still, holding. Purnell Hocht walked to the fireplace. He placed both hands palms flat on the sandstone facing. Warm, hours after the last fire. Still warm. He stood there with his hands on the stones for almost a full minute. Mabry watched him. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself. He didn't offer the sentence. She could see him turning over in his mind the one that began, "I may have been hasty when," or "I want to say that I always thought." He didn't try to build a story in which he had been less wrong than he had been. He took his hands off the stones. He turned around. "Half a cord every 2 weeks," he said, not a question. "Sometimes less," she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man recalibrating. He left. Still without apologies, still without explanations. The door closed behind him, and Mabry stood in the warm room and listened to his footsteps recede down the slope, and she thought, that's enough. Not satisfaction, not victory, just enough. Word travels fast in a valley where people have stopped traveling. She didn't know later exactly how the information moved. She didn't need to know. In a community contracted by cold news moves the same way warmth does, from the warmer place to the colder one, seeking equilibrium, filling the gaps. By December 5th, 3 families had asked Edgar whether they could come and see the dugout. He came home and told her. "Tell them to come," she said. Whenever they want. The door's always open." He looked at her. "You sure?" "I'm sure. The best advertisement for the idea is the idea." The first family came on December 5th, the Calhards Bess and her husband with their 2 boys. They stood in the doorway for a moment, adjusting to the temperature. Then Bess Calhard walked to the wall and put her hand on it, stood there, said nothing for a long time. Then, "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't," Mabry said. "Not for certain." "Then how did you—" "My daughter was sick. I couldn't afford to be wrong." Bess Calhard looked at her across the room, and something passed between them that didn't need words. By December 10th, 7 families had made the trip up the hill. Some stayed 5 minutes, some stayed 2 hours. All of them left with the same expression, that particular look of a person who has just been shown something obvious, something that had been sitting in plain sight, something they could have seen at any point in the last 5 months if they hadn't been too committed to the existing way of seeing. Mabry showed them all the same things: the stone floor, the earthen walls, the small firebox, the ventilation channels. She explained simply without lecture the principle at work: earth holds, temperature, stone holds, heat, reduce exposure, and the fire doesn't have to fight the cold, it just has to maintain a margin. "How much do we need to dig?" asked Abel Price, the man who had told her in September that her design misunderstood moisture. He was pulling out a small notebook when he asked it. She recognized the notebook. It was the same kind she had. 12 feet minimum, she said. Deeper if you can manage it. South-facing slope, always. But Odell Quorm had not come. December 10th, 16 days into the freeze, and still the sky stayed that hard crystalline blue that didn't have warmth anywhere in it. This bothered her, not because she needed him to come, not because his approval would change anything about the 62 degrees in her living room or the quiet breathing of her sleeping daughter, but because Odell Quorm represented something in this valley that mattered, not just experience, but the willingness of a community to update its understanding of what was possible. If Odell came, other men would come, men who hadn't come yet because they were waiting to see if Odell Quorm would come first. That's how credibility works in a small place, not democratically, through specific people, through the ones the community has decided are worth following. She knew this. She waited. Then came the night of December 12th. That was the night Cass woke at midnight with a fever. Not high. 101. The ordinary fever of a child who has picked up a winter chill, nothing like the frightening climbs of the previous 2 winters. Mabry was at her side in seconds. The listening for her daughter part of her brain had never really learned to sleep, not in winter, not since the first December in this valley. She checked the temperature, 101, rising slightly. She checked the room temperature, 60 degrees. The fire had been banked for 5 hours. The stones were holding. The earth was holding. The room temperature had dropped 2 degrees since she checked it at 7. She sat in the chair beside Cass's pallet. She did not go outside to get wood. She did not need to. She put a cool cloth on Cass's forehead. She held her daughter's small, hot hand in both of hers. She sat in the 60-degree room that she had built with her own hands and her father's voice and a lifetime of watching the earth keep its secrets, and she said nothing, and she did nothing except be there, which was exactly what she needed to be. By 2 in the morning, the fever had broken. Cass turned over in her sleep, the restless turning of a child whose body has finished the work it started, and she settled into the deeper breathing of the other side of illness. Mabry sat for another hour without moving, just listening, just feeling the warmth of the stone floor through the soles of her feet. This is what she had built it for, not to prove a point, not to be right, not to watch Pernell Hocht recalculate at the fireplace, for this exact hour, for the right to sit in a warm room in a Montana winter at 2 in the morning and not be afraid. She did not hear Odell Quam climb the hill. It was late, well past 9 o'clock, full dark temperature at 31 below. She was mending by the lamp. Edgar had gone to sleep. Lorne was already deep under his blankets. Cass was breathing easily, the fever long gone, her color good. Mabry heard the footstep on the stone threshold. One footstep, careful, the footstep of a large man trying to be quiet, which is to say, not very quiet. She looked up. Odell Quam was standing in the doorway, not knocking, not speaking, just standing there with his hat in his hands, which was the posture of a man who had come without knowing exactly what he was going to say when he arrived, which is the most honest posture there is. She set down her mending. He came in. He walked as she had watched everyone walk to the fireplace stones. He placed his palm against them, held it there. His face did something that she had not seen Odell Quam's face do before, a kind of quiet working, the expression of a man who is revising a belief he has held for a long time and finding the process more difficult than the conclusion. He looked at the earthen walls. He looked at the stone floor. He looked at Cass asleep. He looked at Mabry. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words, no preamble, no construction of a sentence that softened the landing, just the words, direct, the way a man who has been right for many years says the words, because he knows that the only way to say them with dignity is to say them cleanly. She looked at him. "Come in," she said. "See for yourself." He already was inside. She meant see all of it, not just the warm stones. See the ventilation channels. See the angle of the firebox. See the stone floor and what it's doing. She meant, "I'll show you everything I know." He stayed for 40 minutes. He asked about the depth of the excavation, the composition of the roof, the drainage system along the western wall, the stone selection, the mortar ratio. He asked each question like a man who had spent decades in this trade and was genuinely revising his understanding of a principle he thought he had already mastered. He did not compliment her. He did not say well done or remarkable or any of the words that would have put distance between them, the distance of a teacher acknowledging a student or a man acknowledging a woman's unexpected competence. He asked questions. She answered them. That was better. "How deep did you dig?" he asked again, as if he needed to hear it one more time to believe it. 12 feet into the slope, 18 inches down for the floor. He looked at the floor. "I have been building in this valley for 16 years, he said, "and I have never once done it this way." "No one has," she said. "That's why it works." He looked at her, and for the first time since August, since he had stood at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed and told her she was wasting good timber, he smiled. Not a big smile, not a warm smile exactly, the smile of a man who has found something worth learning. "I'd like to bring some people up," he said, "if you're willing." "Bring them," she said. He put his hat back on. He left. She watched him go down the hill, his footsteps crunching in the snow, and she stood in the doorway of the dugout she had built with her own hands for a long moment before she came back inside. The fire was out. The room was 62 degrees. Over the next 10 days, 14 families made the trip to the dugout. Some came because Odell Quam told them to. Some came because the cold had simply worn them down to the point where pride was less important than warmth. Some came because their children were coughing and they had run out of wood, and they were finally willing to ask a question they should have asked in July. Each time, Mabry showed them the same things. Each time someone asked how much wood she was burning. Each time she answered, she watched them do the arithmetic, watched them look around the room at Cass, playing at Lorne, reading at the unlit fireplace, whose stones were still, even now, warm to the touch, and recalculate everything they thought they knew about winter. Not all of them believed it immediately. Some needed to come back a second time. That was fine. The door was always open. December 16th, 32 days after the freeze began, the temperature rose. Not dramatically, not a thaw, just a rise. From 31 below to 18 below, then 12 below, then on the 18th, a single degree below zero, which felt, after what they had come through, almost balmy. The valley exhaled. Fires were restoked. Chimneys were checked. Wood was inventoried with the grim arithmetic of people who had come much closer than they planned to running out. Purnell Hocht had burned through his 8 cords. Every stick of it. He was buying green wood from Abel Price at a price that would have been criminal in October and was merely expensive in December. Odell Quorum had lost the use of his northeast corner until spring, when the mortar could be properly repointed. The Calhard family had moved 3 of their children into the single warmest room of the house and slept in a pile for the last 2 weeks of the freeze. Mabry Vick had half a cord left. She was not going to make a speech about this. She was not going to say, "I told you so." Not because she didn't feel it, she was human, she felt it, but because "I told you so" was for people who needed to be told they were right, and she didn't need that. She already knew she was right. She had known since October, since the first night since the stone floor held its temperature through the dark hours and Cass slept without coughing. The proof wasn't for her. The proof was for them. And now they had it. December 18th, the valley in the first tentative warmth of a partial thaw. Men gathered at the trading post around the big central stove, the way they always gathered, the way they would always gather. And the conversation that had been circling for 32 days finally landed where it had always been going. "She's burning half a cord every 2 weeks," someone said. Someone else. "I saw it myself. The fire was out when I went up there. 6 hours, maybe more. Still warm inside." Silence. "How deep does she dig?" 12 feet. "What about the roof?" "Sod, 12 inches. And the floor is stone, river stone, packed in sand." More silence. The kind of silence that happens when a community is in the process of changing its mind, when the weight of evidence has finally exceeded the weight of what everyone already believed. Nobody said her name. They didn't have to. She was the only person in the valley whose dugout any of them had seen, the only person whose fire had been out for 6 hours on the coldest night of the year, and whose room was still 62 degrees. They talked about it for 2 hours. And then Purnell Hocht, who had started all of this, who had written to Odell Quorum in August and said, "She's building herself a grave," who had gathered men at the trading post and dismissed the idea before anyone had even seen it work. Purnell Hocht set his coffee cup down on the counter and said, "I need someone to build me one of these." The room was quiet. "Can't do it myself," he said, "but I know who can." Nobody asked who he meant, because the answer was obvious. Because in this valley now, in the aftermath of 32 days of cold that had tested everything and found it wanting, there was only one person who had built the thing that worked, and her name was Mabry Vick, and the door of her dugout was open, and the stones were still warm. January 1888. The freeze was over, but the cold wasn't. This is an important distinction. The word over implies something finished, something resolved, but Montana winter in January doesn't finish, it just pauses, steps back, catches its breath. The temperature had climbed from 31 below to 8 below, which meant people could stand outside for more than 2 minutes without their faces making decisions they'd regret. 8 below was not warm. 8 below was just survivable. And in that thin margin between survivable and warm, the Bitterroot Valley was taking stock. Wood piles, chimneys, how many cords remain, how many weeks of winter were left, how many times a family could be this close to the edge before the edge stopped being a warning and started being a result. The arithmetic was not good for most of them. Mabry Vick had half a cord of wood left and 4 months of winter remaining. She would need another cord, maybe 2. She knew that. She'd budgeted for it, but she was buying from a position of margin, not scrambling, not rationing, not burning furniture. She was standing in a field with room to move. That feeling, that particular feeling of having enough room to move, she had not felt it in a Montana winter before. She hadn't realized until she felt it how much of the last 2 winters she had spent operating without it. Purnell Hocht came to the dugout on January 4th, different this time, not dusk, not alone with his hat in his hands and his pride going somewhere complicated. He came in the morning. He came with a piece of paper. He came the way a man comes when he has made a decision and is now executing it. He knocked. Mabry opened the door. They looked at each other. "I want to hire you," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "To build what you built. For my family." He held out the paper. "I've sketched the slope behind my property. South-facing. Good drainage. I want to know if it'll work." She took the paper. She looked at it. She looked at him. This was the man who had ridden to Odell Quorum in August and said she was building herself a grave. This was the man who had gathered people at the trading post and performed the arithmetic of her failure before she'd even finished the roof. This was the man who had watched from the road with the expression of someone waiting for a mistake to confirm itself, and now he was standing at her door with a sketch and a commission. She thought just briefly, just for the space of one breath, about saying no, about what it would mean to say no. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she said, "The slope will work, but you'll need to go 15 feet and not 12. Your drainage pattern runs east. I'll need to see it in person before I commit to the floor layout." Purnell nodded. "Name your price," he said. She named it. He didn't flinch. "One condition," she said. He waited. "You pay in lumber." He looked at her, looked at the dugout, understood without needing it, explained the particular justice of this arrangement. The man who had profited from the valley's fuel dependency, paying her in the material she needed least. "Done," he said. He left. She stood in the doorway with the sketch in her hands and watched him walk back down the slope. His footsteps left clean marks in the January snow. She thought about her father, about 30 years underground, about hands that knew what stone held. It just outlasts it. Odell Quorum came to the January Trading Post meeting. This was not unusual. He came to every meeting. He had come to every meeting since 1871. This time he stood up without being asked. He said, "I want to talk about the Vick dugout." The room went quiet, the particular quiet of people who have been waiting for exactly this and are now trying to look like they haven't been waiting. He talked for 12 minutes. He walked them through the temperature differential, 62 degrees inside against 30 below, outside a 92-degree spread maintained with a fire loaded twice a day. He described the stone floor, the earthen walls, the sod roof. He described in the precise language of a man who has built things for 16 years and is now revising 16 years of assumptions, why each element worked and what principle it was working on. He did not say I was wrong again. He had said it once. That was enough. What he said was, This valley needs to build more of these before next winter. And then he sat down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Abel Price said, "How deep does she dig?" And Odell said, 12 feet minimum, deeper if the slope allows. And someone else said, "What about the roof?" And someone else said, "Who does she use for the stone?" And suddenly they were all talking at once, not about whether it worked. That question had been answered by 32 consecutive days of evidence. They were talking about how deep, which slopes, which stone, how to handle drainage. The questions of people who have decided to learn something. Mabry wasn't in the room. She heard about it that evening from Tessali, who had heard it from her husband who had been there. Tessali sat at the table in the dugout with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and she told the whole story without embellishment, but without omission, which is its own kind of precision. When she finished, she looked at Mabry. Mabry was quiet for a moment. He did that without being asked. Another moment. Mabry said. Tessali looked at her. That's all you have to say? What would you prefer? Something more dramatic. You've earned something more dramatic. Mabry picked up her tea. Odell Quorm stood up in a room full of men and told them they needed to build more dugouts. That's worth more than dramatic. Tessali considered this. You're very annoying when you're right, she said. I know, Mabry said. And they both laughed. Not a triumph laugh, not the laugh of women who have won something, the laugh of two people who have been cold for a long time and are finally allowed to be warm, the laugh that comes out when you have been holding something for months and you can finally set it down. Two women in a warm room in January, laughing. That was enough. February 1888. This is what they don't tell you about winning, about being right, about building the thing that works while everyone tells you it won't. They tell you about the vindication, about the moment Odell Quorm stands up in a room and tells everyone they were wrong, about the moment Pernell Hocht comes to your door with a commission, about the temperature readings and the wood savings and the community that turns one family at a time toward the thing you made. They tell you about all of that. They don't tell you about the February night, the night about 6 weeks after the freeze ended, after Odell's meeting, after Pernell's commission, after the first 3 families had begun their excavations, after all of it, the night when Edgar and Lauren were asleep and Cass was asleep and the valley outside was dark and quiet under a foot of February snow, and Mabry sat alone in the dugout for the first time since they'd moved in, with nothing she needed to do, no stone to reset, no family to show through, no question to answer, just the room, just the warmth, just her. She sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, cold because she hadn't loaded it since afternoon, because the stones were holding, and she put her hand flat against the wall, the earth wall, cool to the touch, not cold, never cold, just the steady, patient temperature of something that had been underground long enough to stop caring what the weather was doing. She sat there, and she thought about her father. She thought about being 7 years old in a mine shaft, pressing her small hand against the tunnel wall while her father crouched beside her. She thought about the way he smelled coal dust and machine oil and the cold air that lives underground, which is different from the cold air above ground, which has less edge, less hunger. She thought about his hands, large and calloused and capable of doing 100 things she had never watched him do. She thought about the word Rowena, the private name, the name he only used when it was just the two of them, when he was trying to say something that mattered. Stone doesn't argue with cold Rowena. She had been carrying that sentence for 27 years. She had not known until she needed it that she was carrying it. That's the thing about what fathers give their daughters. It doesn't always arrive when they give it. Sometimes it arrives decades later. In a cold October, in a Montana valley, when a woman is running out of options and running out of time, and she picks up a warm rock and hears very clearly, in the voice of a man who has been dead for 11 years, the sentence that changes everything. She had not been a carpenter's wife building a shelter. She had been a daughter remembering a lesson, and that lesson had kept her family warm through the worst winter in recorded Montana history, while the rest of the valley burned through everything it had. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried over victories. She saved that for later, for the small things, for the morning in April when Cass ran through the doorway, no coat, no wheeze, into the first genuinely warm morning of the year, and shrieked with the pure animal joy of a child who has survived a thing she didn't know she was surviving. That was when Mabry cried, not in the February dark. She sat in the chair with her hand on the wall, and she did not cry. She just felt it, all of it, the 7 months, the digging, the rain and the cracked wall, and the mud, and the neighbors and Purnell Hocht, and the long cold nights, and the thermometer on the roof beam, and the notebook full of numbers, and the half-cord left, and the stones still warm. She felt all of it, and she held it the way the stones held heat. And then because she was her father's daughter, and her father was a practical man who did not dwell when there was still work to be done, she got up, added 2 pieces of wood to the firebox, and went to bed. Spring came in March, the way Montana springs come, not with warmth exactly, but with the absence of the worst cold, the absence of the kind of cold that makes decisions for you. Edgar built Purnell Hocht's dugout in 6 weeks, not alone. Mabry designed it, marked the slope, laid out the floor plan, specified the stone position, the firebox. Edgar built it the way he built everything, carefully, precisely, with the respect for material that was the best thing about him. They worked together in a way they hadn't worked together before, because this was not Edgar's expertise applied to Mabry's idea. It was both of them working from the same understanding toward the same thing. On the day they finished, Purnell walked through the interior, pressing his hands against walls and floor and stones. He checked the ventilation channels. He crouched and examined the drainage system along the western wall. Then he stood up and looked at Mabry. "My wife wants to know," he said, "if you'd be willing to show her how to load the fire correctly." Mabry looked at him. "Send her up," she said. "Bring the children." He nodded. And that was the closest Purnell Hocht ever came to an apology, which was she had decided close enough. By March, 3 families had begun excavations of their own. By May, 2 more. By the autumn of 1888, 5 new dugouts were under construction in the Bitterroot Valley, and the conversations at the trading post had shifted from whether this worked to how to do it better. Deeper, shallower for certain slopes. What about families whose property didn't have suitable south-facing hillsides? Could you build into a flat bank with the right engineering? Questions, good questions, the kind that come after if has been answered and the real work begins. Mabry answered them all, at the trading post, in her kitchen, at the construction sites of the new dugouts, where she crouched beside excavations and pointed at things and explained patiently and without condescension what worked and why. Odell Quam built his own dugout in the summer of 1888. He didn't ask for her help, but he built it 12 feet deep, south-facing, with a stone floor packed in river sand, a small, efficient firebox, 12 inches of sod on the roof, and ventilation channels angled exactly right. She walked past his property one afternoon and saw the finished structure from the road. She stopped. She looked at it. It was good work. She thought he learned. And then she walked on. By 1890, 11 families within 15 miles of the Vic property had built some version of an earth shelter. Some were dugouts, like Mabry's, built into hillsides fully earth-sheltered on 3 sides. Some were hybrids, existing cabins with earth-sheltered additions using the original structure as a windbreak and the hillside as insulation. Some were variations that had evolved from conversation, from trial and error, from the particular needs of particular slopes and soil types and families. No two were identical. All of them worked, and nobody called them holes anymore. They called them dugouts, earth shelters, sometimes in the way that communities name things without meaning to. They called them simply without explanation a Vic. We're building a Vic behind the north pasture. Their Vic held 60 degrees all through January. You should talk to Mabry Vic before you stake your slope. She never asked for this. She never sought it, but she heard it now and then at the trading post, in conversation, in the half-heard remarks of people who didn't know she was listening. And when she heard it, she felt not pride exactly, something quieter than pride, something that felt like being correctly understood. Cass did not cough that winter, or the winter after, or the one after that. The child who had rattled and wheezed from her first Montana December grew up in the dugout, grew up quiet-lunged and strong. She grew up watching her mother answer Odell Quorum's questions without flinching and take Pernell Hacht's commission without crowing. She grew up knowing that knowledge doesn't expire, that what your grandfather understood about stone, your mother can use to keep you warm, that the sentence that sounds ordinary when you hear it can turn out 20 years later to have been the most important thing anyone ever said to you, which is how things survive, not through fame, not through monument, through the small, precise transmission of one person's understanding to another across a kitchen table or a mine shaft or a cold October hillside. The dugout stood for 43 years. Mabry and Edgar lived in it through the winters until 1902, when they built a larger home downslope, a proper house, timber-framed, with more rooms and more light. But they kept the dugout. They kept it the way you keep something that saved your life, not on display, not as a monument, but as a fact, present, useful. They used it as a root cellar, as a storm shelter, as the place Lorne brought his own children years later when the temperature dropped below 20 and he wanted them to know something about what warmth was made of. In 1930, the entrance caved in. Nobody repaired it. By 1935, the sod roof had completed its return to the hillside, not a collapse, just a gradual absorption, the grass growing back over the timber frame, the earth reclaiming what it had lent. By 1950, there was a depression in the slope, a remnant of stone foundation, an outline if you knew where to look and what you were looking for. Mabry Vic's name does not appear in any historical record of the Bitterroot Valley. No plaque, no mention in the county history published in 1912, no credit line next to the 11 earth shelters that were built following the winter of 1887. The technique spread organically, the way good ideas spread when the community that adopts them doesn't particularly care who originated them. It just became something people knew, something people did. A Vic, though, that name faded too, within a generation, once the technique had been absorbed completely into the fabric of how the valley built. She didn't need the record. She needed Cass to stop coughing. Cass stopped coughing. Everything else was surplus. This is the part of the story that matters, not the dugout, not the 62 degrees, not the half cord of wood or the vindication at the January meeting. This part. Mabry Vick did not invent earth shelter construction. She was not the first person to understand thermal mass. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains had built earth lodges for centuries, structures that regulated temperature in both directions, warm in winter and cool in summer, built with an understanding of the Earth's thermal properties that predated any European settler in Montana by 1,000 years. The principle was not new, the principle was ancient, but it had been forgotten, or more precisely, it had been dismissed. Dismissed because a dugout didn't look like progress, didn't look like civilization, didn't look like the kind of thing a respectable family built in 1887. It looked primitive. It looked like going backward. And so families froze in their proper timber cabins, while an idea older than the nation sat dormant in the earth waiting for someone humble enough to ask the right question. Not what does everyone else do, but what works. Modern engineers are building earth-sheltered homes now. Passive solar design, thermal mass construction, geothermal stability. We've given these things new names and refined the methods and added technology to optimize what was already in 1887 working perfectly in a dugout on a Montana hillside. The core principle hasn't changed. Let the earth regulate temperature instead of fighting it. Build with the land instead of against it. Use what the earth has already stored instead of burning through everything you have to compensate for what you haven't. It still works. It works whether you call it by its modern names or by its old names or by no name at all. It works whether anyone gives you credit. It works in the cold, which is the only test that ever mattered. Now, before I go, there is a question I want to ask you, because this story isn't about Montana. It isn't about 1887. It isn't really about dugouts. It's about the warm rock that was sitting there for 20 years in the mine shaft, in her father's voice, in the notebook of temperature readings that nobody asked to see before she needed it, before the moment came when she picked it up and held it in both hands and understood finally what it had been trying to tell her. We all have those rocks, things we know, things we learned from people who are gone now, things we wrote down in notebooks or carried in our bodies or heard once from someone in a kitchen and never forgot, even though we didn't know at the time that we needed to remember it. Those things don't expire. They wait. They hold their temperature the way stones do, not broadcasting, not demanding, just holding, keeping what they were given, ready to give it back when the moment comes. Have you ever pulled something out like that? Some piece of knowledge, some skill, something you thought you'd put down for good and found it still warm, still useful, still exactly what the moment needed? Have you ever been told that what you built wouldn't work, that you were wasting good timber on a roof you'd tear down in a year, and have you built it anyway because someone you loved was sick and you couldn't afford to be wrong? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The earth remembers warmth. That's what her father told her. Not in those words, he wasn't a man for those words. But that was the thing. The earth remembers warmth the way stone does, the way a floor you've walked on 1,000 times does, the way a place you've loved does even after you've left it. It doesn't forget, it just waits. And when the cold comes, and the cold always comes, in Montana, in marriages, in the years after loss, in the long middle of things that don't seem to be ending, the warmth is still there, stored, patient, radiating back slowly in the dark. You just have to build something that lets it do its work. There is a depression in a hillside in the Bitterroot Valley. You would not notice it unless you were looking, but the stone foundation is still there under the grass, the outline of a floor-fitted river rock, packed in sand level and tight, the remnant of a firebox. The stones Mabry chose one by one from the creek bed, chosen for density, and the ability to hold heat chosen, because her father told her what stone does with cold. The dugout is gone, but the earth it was built into the south-facing slope, the steady 52-degree depth, the soil that has been holding its temperature without ceremony since before there was a name for why that's still there, still holding, still warm, as it always was, as it always will be. The cold doesn't win, not if you know what to build, and not if you remember what your father told you.